factory headings for multiple impact re-entry vehicles.
What's that mean?
I don't know, but it's great.
All stations, this is Crystal Palace.
Hey, all. Hey, we're going to get started in just a few minutes. Don't forget that if you ask questions, you get more raffle tickets for the Android. So start thinking of what you're going to ask. We'll get started in just a minute.
7, correction 8. That's 8 Redbirds. Get on the sack. Tell them to flush the bombers.
Russians are still denying everything, sir.
Who are you working with?
Nobody.
I don't have to believe you.
Today we have Soviet missile warning.
Placed under arrest pending indictment for espionage.
Espionage?
Confidence is high. I repeat, confidence is high.
Cobra Dane, is this an exercise?
Negative, this is not an exercise.
Get me the president on the horn.
It's still playing the game. It's gonna start a war.
Close up the mouth.
Is this a game or is it real?
War games. Playing soon at a theater near you.
Shall we play?
Inside every girl is a castle-storming, tradition-breaking adventure lover who's not afraid to sing about it.
I want adventure in the great white somewhere.
Dream big, princess.
The residents of 817 East 8th Street are about to lose everything they have.
What do you mean those tenants are still in there?
Tonight. I'll have them out by tonight.
Nothing in this world can save them. Nothing but a miracle. Steven Spielberg presents a Matthew Robbins film.
Welcome to America. Spaceships from a very small planet. Very small. This is history. Machines that reproduce themselves.
I like being a family again. What the hell is that? It's them, the little guy.
I don't know how you got here or why you picked us.
Somebody's helping. Somebody's bringing them together.
Is that why you're here?
Batteries Not Included, starring Hugh Plummer and Jessica Tanner.
I'll just put them in the bowl. I just put them in the bowl. Here. Morning, everyone. Can I ask the panelists to come up to their seats? No order needed. I'm going to get coffee and we'll get started. Oh. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Los Angeles and the OpenStack. No. Oops. We've done breakfast there. Welcome to the Open Source Summit and our Pancake Breakfast. I'm Alex Williams, founder and editor-in-chief of the New Stack, and we do these breakfasts at conferences around the world, and we just like to have a good conversation, enjoy some pancakes, as we say, have a short stack with the New Stack. So we are here this morning to talk about the future of hardware and open source software. And it's one of those topics that can be quite dreamy. For someone like myself, I love it. So what we're going to do is we're going to have some conversation about what is this intersection and what does that mean? Where are we going? What's the future? And one of the things that's so interesting to me is if you think about our lives, especially the people in this room, we're so much in the future in many ways, but still the future seems so far away. When you look at these films like we had clips of earlier, you see what look like drones coming and saving a diner and batteries not included. You have robots that are like shooting lasers at tanks. And a lot of this stuff, though, is not real at all. It still isn't. Even some of these films are 10, 20 years old. So that seems to me to be a way to think about where we are with this ecosystem now. We're kind of at this point now where we're kind of like way in the future, but we're still a long way from there, right? So we're seeing such rapid innovation in the container technology space, for example. We're seeing new models develop around serverless technologies. We're seeing new examples of edge computing. The list goes on and on and on. So that's really going to be what we talk about this morning. But before I get started with introducing the panelists, I want to give a big thanks to Pancake this morning for sponsoring the Pancake Breakfast. Let's give them a big hand. Ground rules. You have each submitted your raffle ticket for a drawing that we are going to do at the end of the discussion today for an Arduino starter kit and the book that goes with it. See how far ahead, but yet we're not? So why don't we get started? And what I'd love to do is have the panelists introduce themselves. And this is just off the top of my head. If there's a favorite movie that you have, that you can think of that represents the future, but not the future. Star Wars is mine. Ashley, can you introduce yourself?
I am Ashley. Hey, how do computers work, Alex?
Oh. We have a mic down.
Check.
Yeah. Hello. Oh, hello. Okay, cool. This one works. I am Ashley McNamara. I am a developer advocate at Microsoft. My favorite movie is Star Wars. Thanks a lot, Alex.
Yes. Well, hey, we have good taste.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
I guess we'll.
Oh, hey.
I don't know. This one's working out. Okay. I'm Aaron Welch. I'm the co-founder of Entity.
Oh, yes.
Firefly.
Okay. Good one.
Chris Wright, Red Hat, and I'm not sure what my favorite one is. There's too many, but I really liked war games. I hadn't even thought of it in a long time until I saw this movie poster up here, so thank you for that.
Oh, yeah.
Would you like to play a game?
Yeah. Would you like to play a game? Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Alex. This is Nithya Ruff, and I'm with Comcast. And one of my favorite movies, I don't remember the name, but it was about this guy who fell in love with his operating system.
Oh,
right?
yes.
And I saw her.
What?
That's it. I thought that was weirdly interesting.
Yeah, I recently got OK Google. I mean, Google Home, and I'm in the basement. I'm like, OK Google, and I feel like this is getting weird. I don't know what's going on here. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And my name's Al Gillen. I'm an analyst with IDC. I'm responsible for overseeing our developer research and open source software. And I'm not really much of a movie fan, but I'll just comment that I was back in the 60s and 70s, whenever it was, a big fan of the Star Trek series, the original series, mostly because the technology that was introduced there really was so forward-looking, and most of those things that we saw there in that show have over time begun to emerge.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to do a quick poll of everyone in the audience. Can you raise your hand if you're a software engineer? Okay. How many people would consider themselves in IT? How many people would consider themselves developers? How many would consider them all the above? It's getting there. It's getting there. So, Aaron, I want to start off with you, and talking about this theme that we're focusing on, where we're looking at kind of films and we remember War Games as an example, right? Where, it was almost like this mass takeover, right, of thermonuclear systems, right? But with Pancake, you guys are focusing on a lot of your focus lately is on edge networks and the development of these edge networks. And where do you see that intersection with edge networks and open source software, so we can close that gap a little bit between what is actually we dream about in the future and what is actually the reality?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I hope our edge locations don't cause thermonuclear war, but yeah, I think what we're seeing, and the reason that we're kind of diving into that direction, so we're basically a public cloud platform, for those who aren't aware. And we have our sort of, standard old school style big flagship data centers that just have lots of options and lots of, capacity that are in kind of the major areas that people are familiar with. And that's a similar model with Amazon and the other big cloud providers. But as we get into applications, especially around Internet of Things and self-driving cars and gaming and ad tech networks that require really low latency to compute, we're finding that there's a lot more demand for having that compute resource closer to actually where these things exist, as opposed to sort of out in Ashburn or something like that. And traditionally, edge networks and edge CDNs and caching have been very good at doing that with static assets. But now we're finding, and I think especially with the advent of containers and serverless computing, the ability to sort of cache functions much more closer to these devices and these end users is going to become much more common. And I think you see some telecoms like AT&T sort of starting to get into that. And it's going to become much more relevant as you have, very latency sensitive applications.
So, Nydia, one of the things I'm curious about is you've been involved in companies where you've helped develop an open source culture. And the open source culture, how would you characterize that culture that has developed, with the companies that you've worked for? And how does that reflect on this discussion today and the future? Because so much of it is on working in very much still traditional environments behind desktops or PCs, I'm just curious on your thoughts and perceptions on developing in those open source cultures where we're thinking about now this next generation of hardware and software that's really going to just be such a part of our lives.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I worked at Wind River Systems, which was embedded software. So you really needed to be very, very close to the hardware. And then it was also an Intel subsidiary. And one of the lessons learned from Intel, people would always say, I thought you guys were a hardware company and a manufacturing company, but we had one of the largest software groups ever, because you needed to make sure your software ecosystem was ready for your hardware, and you needed to optimize it for the processors, and you needed to make sure that the reference implementations were all built before it came out. So from an open source perspective, we realized that we needed to work very, very closely with the kernel and with the software ecosystem around the hardware, and not just focus on the hardware. At SanDisk as well, we did the same thing. We wanted to make sure that we fit into any host ecosystem that the storage needed to work with. And so the open source team really worked closely with, NVMe and PCI and all of the other protocols that we needed to work with. So, hardware, software, you've got to work together. There's no such thing as a pure hardware company or a pure software company. I think you need to really work together.
Before we go any further, I want to just say that Joe Jackson is the managing editor of the New Stack. He's my co-host today, and he has the microphone. So if you have any question, you can raise your hand at any time, and we'll go to you, okay? We have a quick first question.
So if we're looking out into the future here, and I think the film's done a great job of setting the scene there. If I look into the future, I'm seeing a future where everything is 3D printed. If you extrapolate that out, if I'm 3D printing my processors, I'm 3D printing my circuit boards, I'm 3D printing everything that goes around it, how do I 3D print my software?
Interesting question, because there's been some research or surveys from researchers in AI who are surmising that somewhere in the next 20 to 40 years, significant amounts of industry will be managed by machines. So arguably, the machines would be printing physical media and then also responsible for programming. That's definitely it's a ways away. Currently, our machine learning techniques are still, there's not a lot of sentient and programming machines yet, but I think it's an interesting place to go, and it obviously raises some amazing ethical concerns and questions about how do you verify what's happening in the machine. But I mean, that would be one potential way to automate.
Joe's got a question.
So to follow up on the end of your answer there, so we are all, like all of the companies, I work for Red Hat, Chris works for Red Hat, and all of our companies are, looking at AI to some level. Do we have a responsibility to have and start thinking about the ethics of that before we actually roll it out into the world? Because we're already seeing the results of social media, for example, and the ethical implications that nobody thought about. We just pushed that stuff out into the world and now we're dealing with it. Do we have a responsibility to think about the ethics of releasing products and maybe not? Like maybe saying we've developed this thing, we shouldn't put it out in the world.
Al, any thoughts on that? This is the most difficult question I can think of. Really it is.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think part of the challenge is in some cases when a technology is developed, you can't always predict how it's going to be used. So even if you went through an exercise to try to do an ethical review of what a particular technology, whether it's intelligent systems automatically generating code, what impact could they have in the industry, you may find that people find another way to use that. So good question. I don't know if there's an easy answer for it.
In the meantime, Ashley, you're very involved in the Go community, right? And you were telling, why did you decide to learn Go when you were first getting started? What was it about it that interested you now? How do you think about the language now as you see kind of just this advent of container technologies and these new types of microservices we're starting to see and edge computing and all this, and looking out in the future where we're kind of discussing ethical issues? I'm curious about your background and, in the Go community and where that takes you.
Sure. So I started out in Go by accident. So I was a Python developer previously. And if you think about it, think about back in the day, like, remember dial-up modems? And when, like CPUs would double in speed every 18 months. And now we're adding more and more cores to things because that's how we're compensating to speed up our software, right? Software was designed in the 90s. We didn't think about containers. We didn't give any of that any thought. And Go developed in 2009. Like, it's a modern programming language. It's quick. It was built with these problems in mind, and so that's why I like Go. That's why I'm continuing to learn Go. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert by any means, but it's the first modern programming language in my opinion. So.
Interesting. We have another, and we have a question over here. Can you tell us just who you are quickly?
Justin Ratcliffe, Fidelity Investments. So open compute, kind of the corollary to open source software, let's say has not had the market uptake. Again, you find it in kind of small things or in really, really big things, aka Facebook. What's your thoughts around why? Why hasn't open hardware had the same market uptake as open software?
I can give you a couple of perspectives. I think it's not as virtually able to, create collaborative software. You can create collaborative software from anywhere. Hardware is quite different. You need to have Gerber files and other design files, and you need to have physical labs and shared spaces and things of that sort. So that's been one of the problems. The other is we still think of hardware as patentable IP. It's where our assets are as companies. I know when I was in a hardware company, that was one of the hardest things to give away. We still kind of clung to our patents and IP around the hardware side, and it's a mindset that's hard to get over in terms of sharing and opening up.
I think there's an uptake question embedded in there as well, which is, so you've built it, you go to OCP, there's a number of server designs, but they're only really being deployed in limited, large quantities, but limited locations. And so I think in there is just ecosystem development and making it usable, making it accessible, making sure all of the normal data center tools work with it. It's a non-trivial thing. When you're working at the scale of a Facebook and you can really invest in your own internal development and processes, you can do a lot of things that an average enterprise couldn't do. And so to get to that kind of ubiquitous adoption, I think it really takes a surprising amount of time and effort.
Yeah, I mean, Packet is relatively new. We're 3 years old, just over 3 years old. And so we really started greenfield and considered OCP. We deployed globally in, 10 plus locations. And the bottom line is, unless you're building your own facility, it's very difficult to find, sort of facilities that have been built by your traditional colo facility vendors that comply with that will even accept that type of rack size. So there's that kind of issue for folks who aren't running their own facilities. And so I think that's why you see the massive scale deployments of OCP. And then there's sort of that middle field where maybe we sit and a lot of people sit where they're able to doing wholesale colo but aren't running their own facilities. And then down at the other end are folks who are doing a few racks. And so it's much easier to say, we have this room in the basement and it's a project and we can drop a few racks in there because we're not already sort of relying on some requirements that, you don't own. So, I mean, we're big fans of OCP. I think it's fantastic. I think that is the way to do it and the way forward. But yeah, the physical world's tough, man. There's a lot going on there.
So Al, I'm curious, what are you seeing now? What are you seeing now as we start this trajectory of being in the future, but not yet quite there? We were talking earlier about, functions, and we write a lot about the serverless phenomena, for example, which seems to be a little bit of a look into where we're going.
Yeah, so when I think about function computing, I think of that as kind of, if you will, almost an ultimate manifestation of platform as a service, simply because you bring your code and you don't worry about anything below the code. You manage your code, and everything else is the service. I'd argue that that's where the industry has to get to. I don't know that the implementation of functions as they exist today from the major cloud providers are necessarily the end game, simply because A, we have a lot of proprietary aspects to those function services, and B, they're not compatible with one another. So, I think that we've got to get to a scenario where function-based computing becomes essentially interchangeable across clouds and offers a multitude of languages and that sort of thing. So what I'm trying to say is I think we're really at a version 0.1 or 0.2 with regards to function computing today.
Interesting. Questions?
Yes. Yeah, Ricky Cow. I want to know what industry do you think that the most focus is going to be on with AI and the newer technologies that are, just starting to come to insight right now?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, what industries do you think that AI and is going to be focusing on.
What are some of the vertical industries?
It would be easier to identify which industries won't be impacted, and I would say it's a really short list, and it's asymptotically approaching zero. Like it's definitely a pervasive technology that will impact everything from supply chain to internal business processes to specific applications for market verticals. I think it's too hard to pick. It's easier to say where it won't be useful.
So the entire computer industry, basically, all the different verticals, everybody, yeah.
With different objectives, of course, right?
Hi, Laura Abbott. So some people have touched on the fact that hardware and software tend to be, both need to be tightly coupled. You have hardware companies must do software, software needs to enable the hardware. But as we move into the next generation, I think we can certainly look back and say that Linux especially has come a long way in terms of enabling support for all kinds of hardware. What sort of unique problems do you see coming for the next generation of hardware and software that maybe we didn't see in the past?
Aaron?
Sorry, I kind of zoned out. Could you just rephrase that really briefly?
Sure. Do you see any unique challenges coming down the pipeline for enabling the next generation of hardware in open source that maybe we haven't seen in the past?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I think this kind of leads into the multi-architecture issue. You know, I think we're seeing everything that is old is new again happening, where we had kind of a cloud, AWS abstracted EC2 world takeover, where you got like some RAM and some CPU, and you didn't really know what the underlying hardware is. And I think, now we're coming back to, applications are getting more specialized, and I think people are going to start looking for like, I really need to offload my SSL termination to the network card, or I really need local super fast NVMe storage, or, I think, that just software in general is getting more specialized, specific, and is going to want to get closer to that hardware. And I think you see players like the ARM community is now kind of making a run into the data center space, and so, you have actual different instruction sets now available in the cloud, so to speak. And so, we work very closely with the ARM community, and watching all of the just sort of software diaspora become portable and working over there is a huge amount of effort. And so, I mean, those are kind of the challenges, right? And I think a lot of developers haven't really had to deal with that before. That's a really low level of programming, and I think we're going to need a lot more people working down there in the sort of guts of the operating systems and the fundamental languages to make sure that they do run on all these different architectures. And that's, I think, going to be probably one of the biggest challenges, is just the talent there.
Ashley, I'm curious on your thoughts on, on these developer communities that will have to emerge to work, build software on different architectures. And we talked about this before with people about how, if we have all these, for instance, these edge devices out there, and they're there, but you need to know how they're going to behave, right? You're going to need to how the software actually works on these devices. What philosophy would you bring into that approach when if you're thinking about those communities that you need to build to kind of like really create that organic movement behind these new architectures and their development?
Oh, geez, Alex, come on. It's like, crying out loud. So
hey, you're early, you're fresh. I know you're gonna. This is an easy one.
I only had 2 cups of coffee, for shit's sakes. So that's one of the things that I like about Go, is that you can run it on literally any operating system, right? Those are things that you haven't had to think about as a software developer previously. You just built your software. You didn't think about the hardware, and now you have to.
Yeah.
There are limitations that you have to deal with, and I think that like you said, we need more people down there. But that's the shitty work that nobody wants to do. Yeah. Nobody wants to do that.
You need the hardware vendors to really own more of that layer, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's what we've always relied on in the embedded and other spaces. you had your BSPs and your SDKs from the semis and from the chip vendors, and then there was an abstraction layer, and then you could build on that. So we still need them to kind of have those things ready.
Right.
Yeah, prototypes and things like that.
So as for a philosophy, Alex, I don't have a philosophy, but
I mean, philosophy is always, it doesn't matter what it is, right? I mean, it's just as long as you have a view. Is there any questions? Oop,
So,
all over.
it's been commented over the last couple of years that open source software is eating the world. And I generally agree to that point. But there are enclaves of proprietary mindsets. Does anybody have any social engineering recommendations on how to convince management that are part of these enclaves on getting them to agree to open source without agreeing to open source their proprietary software or whatever?
I think it's pretty simple when you start seeing your area getting commoditized, and there are some very viable open source projects that do what you do and are rapidly catching up, then management has to get it. Or leadership, you've got to convince leadership that you cannot keep up with the pace of the open source software development that's happening in that area, and that they need to then focus on where they can differentiate, where they can add value, where they can create value, rather than on the base which may already be commoditized. So that's what we did. At Wind, we had a couple of proprietary build systems, and we realized very quickly that Yocto and other build systems were becoming the norm and the standard, and our addressable market was going to be very limited if we kept our build system, which is very proprietary. And so we opened it, and that broadened the market for us.
I'd argue that the social impact is going to come from them being disrupted, either disrupted out of their jobs or having their company disrupted out of business. And if they see that happen to other companies in this industry that they compete with, hopefully that will set off some fire alarms.
What do you see as how this is going to affect the developer tool market, or is it affecting the developer tool market, kind of this, around the scene that we're talking about?
Well, that's a pretty broad question going across the whole industry, but specifically from a developer tools perspective, I mean, you could argue that just about all the major developer tools have moved to either an open source model, or the languages are primarily open source. So the money today is not being made by most companies on the developer tools and the languages and that part of the business. The money's made really at the runtime level. And that's really a statement of how successful open source has been in that segment of the market.
Question?
Yes. Hold on. Good morning, panelists. I want to crowdsource an answer here. Serverless was touched on a bit earlier, so I'd like just to go down the line. How much impact do you believe serverless is going to have in the industry in, say, the next 5 years? And Lambda's currently, obviously, the big mindshare leader. There are some open alternatives like OpenWhisk, and probably a half dozen other things percolating out there. So just, is it overhyped? Is it the ultimate lock-in? Just a quick perspective, and then any other thoughts?
I think it's overhyped. But I don't think that my opinion matters as much as maybe some of these other people, but I think it's overhyped.
Yeah, I think it's overhyped. I think the hosted, I think there is a lot of potential there, especially on the open source side. But I think if you really break it down to its common components, you should be dusting off your Perl books because we're going back to CGI. That's all it is hosted functions. And those can be very useful, but I think it will eventually be another thing in your application toolkit, just like you use Redis, just like you use Postgres, just like you will use also serverless in that batch. But I think that people that are looking to migrate monolithic applications to pure serverless are probably going down a bad rabbit hole at this point.
Somebody did a really good job of marketing is how I feel about it.
Well, I'd argue that it actually serves a need. in the industry. So there's, if you have a particular piece of code that doesn't need to be resident the whole time, I mean, it's nice to be able to invoke it when you need it. But I'm of the opinion that it really has to become more standardized and has to become more portable across clouds. Right now, there's an awful lot of proprietary lock-in, which I think the industry as a whole has made clear this is not really the route that the industry wants to go. So I think there's a lot of evolution that still has to take place.
I agree with Al.
So we had this internal argument that it was CGI, which I love. I do think it's sort of a logical extension of an idealized programming environment is asynchronous and event-driven, and that turns out is a hard way to program. Many programmers aren't capable of that, and so building platforms around that are actually really helpful. I would agree that I think it's definitely filled with hype. It's not realistic to decompose an existing application into a bunch of functions for most people, maybe not even useful. It is definitely a concern around you're locking yourself to the platform unless you have some abstracted way to receive events and launch functions. I think one thing that is interesting that probably is the most compelling part is the charging model. And that is fundamentally different, and I think people are responding in part to the cost.
All right, another question. Hi. At the beginning, the programming language were compiled. Then after come the virtual machine. Then come the interpreted. And then I see that we come again to the compiler, but in one static file, binary. And what do you think will be the next language, also in a VM with a virtual machine or interpreted, or we will keep using static programming languages?
I think it will depend a lot on the environment. So when you look at targeting, so on topic for multi-arch, when you look at targeting, say, offload devices, you want to have a common programming interface from the CPU side. You may have different target offload engines that you're needing to interoperate with. The application doesn't actually want to know the low-level details of the instruction set. So whether that's compiled ahead of time or whether that's a JIT environment, I don't know the details, but I can imagine that that's will be a shift. And it's perpetual circles. So we invented shared libraries, and then we decided that statically linking is really the better way to go effectively with containers, and I'm sure we'll find new efficiencies with something like shared libraries all over again.
Oh, yeah, we got another question.
Yeah, so I was thinking a little bit of the previous comments on the need for more engineers working at the low level, working at the architectural piece, and I'm wondering what those of us in the community can do to help support education, help support industry in like helping build those communities that will lead to that talent being more available to you.
That's a better question, I think.
Those devices.
Go for it, Ashley.
I think that people you admire, like maybe like Jess Frizzell and like Kelsey Hightower, need to be getting into the weeds and letting people know like it's okay. Go do these things, that's cool, versus not.
I think a big one is access to hardware, and I think it is happening a little bit organically.
Oh, that too.
I think, where are you going to get an enterprise board with ARM? You're going to pick up the phone and call like Qualcomm? Like that's not very easy to do, and we're working with ARM to kind of fix that problem. But I think it's already happening a little bit, right? Like the Internet of Things, I think, has been like a big boon to that, because now all of a sudden like programming in Arduino is pretty low level programming, right? And like when you have that physical thing, and even just turning on LEDs like is pretty cool. Like you're only turning on an LED, but that's pretty neat. And so I think you see the more of that, the more workshops that you do, and the more that we kind of can foster that love of hardware in the real world and being able to kind of manipulate it, the more you kind of will see that like spark that I'm sure we all had when we first like made a computer do something.
I agree. The Arduino and the Raspberry Pi have done a lot to make hardware more accessible and more exciting and fun. The other thing I would say is, I know ARM used to do this, and some companies used to create virtual models of virtual prototypes of hardware so that you could, accelerate your software development. But those can be quite interesting and should be encouraged for people to play with and have access to. The last I would say is organizations like Open Compute and certainly hardware vendors like Intel and ARM and others can make, create more excitement around low-level programming, around BSPs, SDKs, and virtual prototyping and things like that. It always seemed to be kind of fall in between the software world and the hardware world, and there was this strange group of people who would do System W and, Verilog and things like that, and that needs to become more exciting.
You can make firmware cool again, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, we got plenty more questions. You're next.
Coming back to the serverless comment, it was mentioned standards. And I think XKCD probably surmised standards perfectly. How can we as an industry stop the proliferation of standards for the sake of standards? It doesn't differentiate anything at the end of the day, really, but it makes things much harder from a developer's perspective to make sure that the software hits the largest market but they want to adhere to standards. Which standards do they pick? Well, I've got 3 standards that do exactly the same thing, etc. Is that something that potentially Linux Foundation should try and drive, or is that a separate body that needs to try and work on that, whether it be OSI, etc.?
I'm curious. I don't actually see proliferation of standards being a problem today. I really see that space slowing down, being eclipsed by open source software development and de facto standardization around common projects. So I think, kind of vote with your feet. One thing that I do see as sort of the corollary to that is proliferation of open source projects that do the same thing. Yes. And so we have a new issue, which is how do you find the best of breed projects and as an industry rally around those, where it's not about a winning solution that becomes the business winning thing for a company, but it's a winning solution that really helps the entire industry and everybody can invest, because the power of open source development is large scale collaborative communities. And the way I think about it is it's really, really easy today to create a new project. Mm-hmm. And the sort of logical extension of that is potentially we each have our own project. And then that's not really very collaborative. So there's some balance in there. And I don't think standards is really the core issue. And even the LF does a little bit of this. OCI is a standardization effort around containers. So some specification helps. But I think it's really the open source software piece that's critical, and then getting communities to rally around common projects is the key.
I agree, and I think the standards world is learning a lot from the open source world, and they're actually doing parallel implementation in code and writing specs at the same time, and to the point where I think specs will probably go away and it'll go straight to code, and the default code wins. But I completely agree. As a vendor, I mean, as a consumer of open source software, it's really hard to kind of know which project to back. And should I put money on both projects and watch them and see which ecosystem grows faster? And so I'd like to see, quicker evolution, if you will, where the weak die and the strong live, and so you can kind of back one standard going forward.
Terrific.
Okay, we have the last question here.
So my question is about hardware. When we talk about hardware, we often talk about compute. But it's the availability of like commoditized compute hardware and open software that's really exploded, technology. But what's the path forward for like network in the enterprise, in the data center, in the home? Where's the open networking hardware? Where's the open networking software? I mean, I know it's there, but it's difficult and it's not obvious yet. What do you see in the next couple of years for open networking?
Interesting.
Great question.
ONAP, right?
There's a lot of investment in that space in open source projects today. It is absolutely, in my opinion, a battle to change the mindset of an entire industry, which is historically 100% proprietary, and it's about standards and black box interoperability. Getting to the point where, so OCP has network hardware. There are, you can run an entire top to bottom open source. You can walk into a data center today that compute storage network is 100% Linux and open source software. It's just going to take time, and part of that is some level of industry shift and where the major players in the industry back open source solutions as part of their product portfolio, I think.
Great. Well, it is time to do the raffle. Come on up at the end of the show. You can talk with everyone. If you have other questions, everyone. But if you ask a question, we need your tickets here. Okay.
Alex, I wanted to.
This is great.
Alex, I wanted to add one thing to the question earlier about software, hardware.
Yeah.
One thing we didn't mention was FPGAs, and so the challenge of common interfaces for discovery, and then programming models, because we're in this, everything could be done on a general purpose CPU today. We're hitting the limits. I mean, there's laws of physics that are getting in the way of going faster, and so offloading to hardware, where the expense of creating specialized hardware all the time is maybe cost prohibitive, so you've got this generalized specialized hardware. Programming that in a way that's not so complex that it's inaccessible or so tied to a specific implementation that you've now created a vertically locked stack, I think is a big challenge for the future.
Well, while we're collecting the last raffle tickets here, I want to again thank Pancake for hosting this breakfast. Let's give them a big round of applause. I'd also like to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been interesting discussion, and all of you asked so many good questions, so we really appreciate that. I think we've had more questions asked here than all the pancake breakfasts we've done. So, without further ado,
I'm going to be really happy if I pick myself. I did not pick myself. 461-578. Anyone?
461-578.
Anyone? No?
There has to be someone. 461-578, no?
Somebody left. Okay. Yes. Maybe this
It's
time.
getting exciting now.
I know. 461-589.
Hey, Joe. Joe, I just have one question for you. So you saw these movies up here. What's your favorite movie that speaks of the future but not?
Blade Runner.
Blade Runner. Nice. All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you coming out.
And then it came to me, I was like,
And now I'm sad I didn't pick like cartoons. Like Rick and Morty is my new favorite thing ever that's ever existed.